And welcome back to the cross-examination in court of the nurse Lucy Letby. Just as a reminder before we start today, Lucy Letby is currently standing trial accused of the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 10 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit. She has pled not guilty to all charges. Nicholas Johnson KC, on behalf of the prosecution, asks about the case of child E. He asks Lucy Letby if it was medical incompetence that led to child E's death, in that the night shift team could have reacted sooner to the child's bleed. Letby replies, possibly, yes. She says once child E was bleeding at 10 p.m, a transfusion could have been made sooner. She says the collective team were responsible. Letby says it was, quote, an important thing to know that plumbing issues were a potential contributory factor to the decline of baby's health in the unit. She said raw sewage would come out of the sinks in nursery room 1 as flowback from another unit. Mr. Johnson asked if Letby ever filled in a Datix form for that. Letby says she did not. Mr. Johnson says Letby did fill in a Datix form for child E. The form is shown to the court. It is dated August the 4th, 2015 at 5:53 am, which is when the form was signed and filed. It is classed as a, quote, clinical incident. The risk grading was high potential harm. Letby says she is not sure about that, as it also says actual harm none, no harm caused. It refers to the death of child E at 1:40 am. Description: unexpected death following GI bleed. Full resus unsuccessful. Time of death 1:40 am. The baby's history is recorded in the events leading up to his death. It was filled in by the Instant Review Group panel. Letby's input on the panel is reporting the incident on the first page of the 9-page report. Letby is asked if she remembers sending a text message to her colleague Jennifer Jones-Key saying it was, quote, too quiet on August 2nd, 2015. Letby says she cannot recall, but accepts that would be something she could send. Letby says there is always something to do, but sometimes they can be long night shifts if you haven't got many babies. She says she enjoyed being busy when it was managed. Letby is asked why she, and not child E's designated nurse Melanie Taylor, signed a correction to a prescription for child E. Letby says it's standard practice for 2 nurses to administer prescriptions, and corrections on the form are not based on seniority. She agrees that she was keen to raise issues if they needed correcting. Nicholas Johnson: had you fallen out with Melanie Taylor by this stage? Letby: no. Letby denies she had fallen out with anyone. She agrees she had confidence in her clinical competencies. Nicholas Johnson: do you agree you were a cut above some other nurses, including Mel? Letby: no. A nursing note for child E from the evening of August 3rd, 2015 is shown. Letby agrees he was progressing well, although he needed insulin. Letby agrees child E at this stage showed no sign of gastrointestinal problems. A rota is shown to the court, showing Letby was the designated nurse for child E and F in room 1. No other babies, nurses were allocated in that room that night. Letby is asked if there was anything wrong with this arrangement. Letby replies, no. Mr. Johnson says when Letby was giving evidence to Mr. Myers, her defence barrister, she said when the mother arrived at the unit, she was, quote, bringing milk. Letby says she does not recall from her memory. Mr. Johnson says that was what she said on May 5th. Letby replies, I can't recall, right here, right now. Letby says she cannot remember it specifically, but accepted that version of events. Quote, I don't have any clear memory. Mr. Johnson refers to the transcript from that day, in which Letby told Benjamin Myers KC she believed child E's mother had arrived at the unit bringing expressed breast milk. Letby says, I said I think she brought expressed breast milk. Mr. Johnson asks about the significance of 9 p.m. that night. Letby replies, I don't know what you mean. Mr. Johnson says it's the mother's evidence that she knew child E was due a feed at 9 p.m, so came down to the unit for that feed. Mr. Johnson says Letby's recollection that child E's mother brought milk with her fixes the time as being 9 p.m. Letby replies, I don't agree. Mr. Johnson asks about the 16ml mucky aspirate, which Letby agrees was taken before 9 p.m. Mr. Johnson asks where the milk for the 9 p.m. feed was coming from. Letby says the milk would come from the milk fridge in nursery room 1. She says she does not remember where the milk would come from for this feed specifically. No feed was recorded for 9 p.m. Mr. Johnson says the SHO did not record no feed for 9 p.m, having said in evidence that would be the sort of thing he would record for a baby. Letby says sometimes doctors don't record such notes. Letby is asked why the large vomit of fresh blood is not recorded on the observation chart for 10 p.m. Letby says she recorded it in her nursing notes and Dr. David Harkness was present when it happened. Letby is asked why she waited over an hour for the observation of the aspirate to be raised with the doctor. Lucy Letby replies, I don't recall speaking to a doctor. Letby does, however, recall speaking to an SHO about it on the phone. Letby says there was no observation of blood prior to 10 p.m. Nicholas Johnson. Was Child E's mother telling the truth about you? Lucy Letby. In what sense? In the sense of what you said to her. When she says she came down to see her boys, she saw Child E with blood around his lips. Child E's mother's illustration of what she says was present on Child E's lips is shown to the court. Nicholas Johnson. Did you ever see anything like that? Lucy Letby. Child E did have blood like that after 2200. Letby adds there was no blood prior to that. Letby accepts she was alone in room 1 when the mother came down. She says that would have been around the handover time at 8 p.m. Nicholas Johnson. You are not telling the truth about that, are you? Lucy Letby. Yes, I am. Letby says she does not accept causing an injury to harm Child E. She denies at any stage having a fallout with Child E's mother. Letby says she has never seen a baby with blood like that around her mouth in her career. She agrees it was wholly exceptional. She denies telling Child E's mother the cause of the bleed was via insertion of a nasogastrinal tube. Letby is asked if she recalls telling the police in the case of Child N that NG tubes can cause bleeding. Letby says it does cause blood, but not in the mouth. Mr. Johnson says Letby has said that previously it can cause oral bleeding. Letby replies, OK. She denies saying that happened in this case. She says, medically speaking, any baby could have a bleed like the sort seen by Child E. A text message from Letby to Jennifer Jones Key is shown. Quote, he had a massive hemorrhage that could have happened to any baby. Letby says at the time it was thought Child E could have NEC, and any baby could have had the condition Child E had. Letby is asked to look at her defence statement. She says Child E's mother had come down with some expressed milk. The statement is dated February 2021. Letby, in her statement, said, quote, this may have been later than 2100. Mr. Johnson says Letby is now ruling out a time before 2200. Letby says she cannot say definitively, but there was no blood prior to 2200. Letby is asked why she did not mention the vomit when blood went down the NG tube in her defence statement. Mr. Johnson says Letby is lying by adding additional detail afterwards. Letby denies this. Mr. Johnson asks about the quote, mucky aspirate for Child E, asking if that is 16 ml of bile, as per Letby's defence statement. Letby says there was bile in the mucky aspirate. Mr. Johnson says there is a difference between bile stained and bile. Letby accepts there was 16 ml of bile in her defence statement and that is an error. She is asked why she put that in those terms. Letby replies, I don't know. Letby says this is a clarification of her earlier statement. Nicholas Johnson, you are lying, aren't you? Lucy Letby replies, no. The defence statement also refers to, quote, blood in the nappy for Child E after he died. Mr. Johnson asks if that has been heard in her evidence. Letby says she cannot recall. Letby says it is written in her nursing notes and nothing was done about it as Child E was deceased by that time. Letby is asked to look at her nursing notes. Mr. Johnson says Letby's nursing notes for child E, as read by Letby during the break, do not record blood in the nappy. Letby says she could not recall her notes specifically at this time. Mr. Johnson reads about what other medical staff observed following child E's collapse. Dr. David Harkness recorded for child E's observations following the collapse, quote, kind of strange purple patches that appeared on the outside of his tummy. Letby says it was purple, but not patches. Letby said that other parts were more pale than the pink described by Dr. Harkness. Dr. Harkness said he'd only ever seen it before with child A. Letby disagrees. She says it was, quote, not the same. Asked to explain the differences between the two, Letby says it was a, quote, solid block of purpleness for child E and a more mottled look for child A. Letby agrees it was over the abdomen, but disagrees the purple patches moved around. Mr. Johnson reads through another doctor's observations, who said she had not seen a discoloration, but Dr. Harkness was animated when he was describing what he had seen to her. Letby says she was not there for the conversation between the two of them. Letby is asked to read her retrospective nursing note for child E, which described Charles E's collapse and subsequent decline until he died in his parents' arms at 1:40 a.m. The note would have been made with reference to medical notes, Letby tells the court. Letby is asked to look at an observation chart for blood and gas. Letby says when things are going on, it would be standard practice to write, also on the back of handover sheets or spare bits of paper. Letby is asked about a purple band of discoloration she had recorded for child E. In her police interview, Letby accepts struggling to recall the size of it at the time. Mr. Johnson says for the evidence given on May 5th, Letby said it was a, quote, red horizontal banding across his abdomen, and only on the abdomen. Letby agrees with Dr. Harkness it was on the abdomen, but does not agree with Dr. Harkness's observation it was patches. Letby is asked to look at a chart showing aspirates for child E, which included, quote, minimal aspirates prior to the collapse. Letby agrees that showed no signs of gastrointestinal issues for child E until the 9 p.m. reading of 16ml mucky aspirate in her writing. Letby cannot recall why Belinda Simcock had written in the 10 p.m. aspirates column. Letby assumes the blood came out following those 10 p.m. readings. Why was Belinda there at all? Letby replies, I can't say for sure. Letby says Belinda had come to assist for the 16ml aspirate observed an hour earlier. Letby says she cannot say why Belinda was carrying out observations at that time. Letby says she cannot explain why the blood aspirate is not recorded in the aspirate chart, but is in her nursing notes. Letby is asked to read a note on the schedule for child E, in which it is said Belinda Simcock gave a feed to a child in room 2 at 10 p.m. Letby says she cannot recall why Belinda Simcock had come to room 1 for the 10 p.m. readings. Mr. Johnson asks if Belinda Simcock was brought in to sign paperwork at the time of the collapse to cover for Letby's actions. Letby denies this. Letby said Belinda Simcock had carried out the drip readings for child E and signed it, as specific information like that is not passed on from one nurse to another. Letby is asked if she recalls who rang child E's mother when child E collapsed. She said it would have been a collective decision to contact the midwifery staff. Letby accepts child E's mother made a phone call at 9:11 p.m, but does not accept the evidence of the conversation about child E, quote, bleeding from his mouth and there was, quote, nothing to worry about. Benjamin Myers-Casey, for Letby's defence, rises to say Letby cannot say what was or what was not said in a phone call she was not a part of. Nicholas Johnson: you killed child E, didn't you? No. Why in the aftermath were you so obsessed with child E and F's mother? I don't think I was obsessed. Letby says she often thought of child E and child F. Mr. Johnson says the name of child E and F's mother was searched for 9 times and the name of the father once. Letby said she searched to see how child F was doing. One of the searches was when child F was on the neonatal unit. Letby said that other searches were made after child F had left the unit, so collectively what she said was correct. Mr. Johnson says Letby was looking for the family's reaction. Letby disagrees. One of the searches is on Christmas Day. Nicholas Johnson: didn't you have better things to do? Letby said the family were on her mind. Mr. Johnson tells the court he is now looking at the case of Child G. He will go out of sequence chronologically and deal with Child F at a later point. Letby says she cannot recall what Child G's due date would have been. Child G having been born at a gestational age of 23 weeks and 6 days on May the 31st, with the date of one of those events not standing out to her. A message from Letby's phone to a colleague, quote, "Due date today!" exclamation mark. Letby says she knew back then at the time, September the 21st, 2015. Letby says the date of the event for Child G was a coincidence. Letby says Child G had extreme prematurity, which had complications requiring additional care. Letby disagrees that Child G was fine by the time she came to the Countess of Chester Hospital, saying she had a number of ongoing issues. Letby denies that Child G was ready to go home by the date of the first event on September 7th, saying babies in the special care room Nursery 4 can still be there for several weeks. Letby says Child G had a number of previous problems, including relating to feeding, and had sepsis. Letby says Child G was on oxygen and had feeding issues by September 7th, 2015. Mr. Johnson asks Letby to look at Child G's nursing records for her days leading up to her projectile vomit. Letby agrees there is nothing unusual in those days. Feeding charts are shown for Child G for September 5th and 6th. Child G is being fed expressed breast milk via the NGT or bottle. Letby agrees the picture is looking good for Child G from these charts. Mr. Johnson says the feed at 11 p.m. on September the 6th would not have been done twice by mistake. Letby says she has never suggested that has happened. Letby agrees the observations for Child G before 2 a.m. on September the 7th are, quote, good. Nicholas Johnson: you knew this was day 100 of Child G's life, didn't you? Letby: yes. It was a big day for her. Letby: yes. Letby agrees she and other nurses would celebrate 100-day-old babies on the unit, and a banner had been prepared to mark the occasion. A staffing rota for the night shift of September 6th-7th is shown to the court. Letby is in room 1 as the designated nurse for one baby, and Elsa Simpson is the designated nurse for one other baby in room 1. A nursing colleague is in room 2 as a designated nurse for Child G. Letby rules out staffing levels or staffing competence as a contributory factor to Child G's death. Asked if anyone had made a mistake, Letby says potentially Child G had been overfed by a nursing colleague, but that was not what she was saying had happened. Letby, quote, "I can't say for definite that didn't happen. I'm not saying she did do that, but it is a possibility." Letby says it is a possibility the amount of milk was mismeasured when calculating the feed. Nicholas Johnson: are you suggesting it's a realistic possibility? Letby: no. Nicholas Johnson KC continues to cross-examine Lucy Letby in the case of Child G. Letby says it was a possibility Child G was overfed by a nursing colleague, but adds, quote, "I don't believe that happened." Mr. Johnson says to overfeed Child G twice as much would have taken twice as long. Letby says 45 mils of milk feed would take around 15 to 20 minutes. Letby refers to medical experts Dr. Evans and Dr. Bowen that overfeeding was a possibility. Mr. Johnson describes what Letby had seen, including that Child G's abdomen was firm and red, with the sight of that and vomit on the floor leaving her shocked. That was a clear recollection you had last week, giving evidence. Letby says that happened at approximately 2:15 a.m. Her nursing note is shown to the court. Quote, "Child G had large projectile milky vomit at 02:15. Continued to vomit plus 45 mils of milk obtained from NG tube with air plus. Abdomen noted to be distended and discoloured. Colour improved few minutes after aspirating tube. Remained distended but soft. to go nil by mouth with IV fluids. Letby says she disagrees with the evidence of Dr. Sandy Bowen, saying a pH reading of 4 can be obtained from milk aspirated from the stomach. A photo of Child G's cot with circles marking where the vomit fell outside of the cot is shown to the court. Letby is asked to look at her police interview for Child G. Letby said it was in her cot. Nicholas Johnson: "This was an extraordinary vomit, the likes of which you had not seen in your career." Letby: "I have, but not in neonates." Letby says it's an oversight she had not mentioned the extent of the vomit in police interview. Letby says Child G was still vomiting when she went to see Child G with Ailsa Simpson. Nicholas Johnson: "You were not there with her, were you?" Letby: "Yes, I was." Letby is asked to look at her police interview. She says at the time of the vomit she did not remember where she was, then went into the room where Child G was. Letby is asked why there is no mention of Ailsa Simpson in the interview. Letby says she was describing her own response. The neonatal schedule is shown to the court for Child G. Mr. Johnson says Letby deliberately misstated the time at which Child G had her vomit at 2:15 a.m. and says it was different. Letby disagrees. Mr. Johnson refers to Dr. Alison Ventress's notes, quote, "Call to RV Child G at 2:35. He says that is an accurate time, and Letby had misstated the time so Letby's colleague could instead be blamed for overfeeding, and Letby instead had overfed Child G. Letby replies, "That's not true." Mr. Johnson asks where the air came from before neopuffing. Letby says she cannot say without looking at the nursing notes. Letby's notes quote, 45 ml of milk obtained from NG tube with air plus. The note does not mention neopuffing. Letby says that is an oversight. Mr. Johnson: "The truth is that you injected Child G with milk and air, didn't you?" Letby replies, "No." Letby is asked to look at her second police interview for Child G. In it, Letby said air had got through the feeding syringe. She tells the court it had been suggested to her as a possibility. Mr. Johnson refers to Child G's 3:15 a.m. collapse, with Dr. Alison Ventress recalling blood-stained fluid coming up. Letby denies inserting something into Child G's airway and or causing the deterioration. Dr. Ventress and a doctor colleague said, quote, 100 ml of air milk had been aspirated from Child G following the 6:05 a.m. desaturation. Letby says she does not recall 100 ml coming out and asks if it was documented. Dr. Alison Ventress's note is shown to the court. It includes, quote, NG aspirated as abdo appeared very large, 100 ml aspirated. Letby, quote, I don't know how the air got there. It's after neopuffing. She accepts the note as an account of what happened. Letby is shown nursing notes made for the following day shift by a colleague. Letby agrees there are no signs Child G had a build-up of fluid or air from the notes made. Mr. Johnson refers to the second bout of vomiting on September the 21st, 2015. Letby said she thought she recalled the mother was there as it was during visiting time. Letby had said she did not believe it was an emergency and did not recall Child G going blue. Asked if she agrees with Child G's father that Child G was, quote, not the same after the first deterioration, Letby replies, I can't comment on that. Nobody knows their babies like the parents do. Mr. Johnson asks why Letby was giving Child G the 9:15 a.m. feed on September the 21st. Letby replies, she wasn't awake and she was due her immunisations. Letby says, feeding-wise, she had no concerns with Child G. She said there was an ongoing issue with Child G's low temperature. For that September the 21st day shift, the court is shown the rota. Lucy Letby was the designated nurse for Child G that day in room 4, along with 2 other babies. Lucy Letby was also responsible for a 4th baby rooming in with parents. Nicholas Johnson. Did it annoy you that you were in nursery room 4? Letby. Not at all. Mr. Johnson says that Letby, when giving evidence, said aspirating can interrupt digestion. Letby replies, when fully aspirating, that can happen. She tells the court on this occasion NGT feeds would be preferable for babies receiving immunisations as they can be quite unwell after them and they may need rest. The court is shown a feeding chart for child G. A 40ml feed of expressed breast milk was given at 9:15 am, signed by Letby. After the feed, there were 30ml 2 projectile milk vomits, Letby noted. Child G also had a large bowel motion, loose watery green, and there was a review by doctors. The note is again signed by Letby. She says she cannot recall which doctors carried out the review from that note. The 9 am reading is recorded on the observation chart for the temperature. Mr. Johnson suggests there are 2 dots in that column recording temperatures. Letby says she cannot recall what the line is below the dot. Nicholas Johnson: did you go back and cook the charts to make it look like child G was declining? Letby replies, no. Letby says both dots are in the normal range. Letby says, I haven't misdocumented anything. 2 dots are recorded in the 3 am column when Letby was not on shift. Letby suggests someone else has misdocumented. Letby's notes for that day are shown to the court. They include, quote, at 10:15, 2 large projectile milky vomits, brief self-resolving apnea and desaturation to 35% with colour loss. NG tube aspirated, 30ml undigested milk discarded, abdomen distended, soft. Doctors asked to review. Temperature remains low. Tachycardic, 18 beats per minute since vomit. Mr. Johnson says it's not an innocent coincidence that child G deteriorated 1 hour after being fed by Letby. Letby replies, yes, it is. Letby is asked to look at her defence statement. It included, quote, I did not shout for help as I did not think it was an emergency. Letby is asked if she sought to minimise what had happened. Letby replies, no. Mr. Johnson refers to Dr. Peter Fielding's note. It says, child G had an episode at 10:20 where she had 2 projectile vomits witnessed by nursing staff. Nurse called for help. Letby denies minimising events, saying this was a self-correcting event for child G. Letby sent in a text to a work colleague, quote, looked rubbish when I took over this morning and then she vomited at 9 and I got her screened. Mr. Johnson says that text has 2 lies in it. Letby accepts she got the time wrong, but says she was not asked about child G's colour. Mr. Johnson says child G was doing well. Mr. Johnson shows a nursing colleague's note from the previous night shift and Letby's nursing note from that day shift. Quote, any suggestion child G was looking rubbish. Letby says child G looked pale, but didn't use rubbish in clinical notes. Letby denies deliberately falsifying times or making up negative observations for child G. Letby denies passing off responsibility to other people as suggested by Mr. Johnson. Nicholas Johnson: in fact, you are the person causing all these problems. Lucy Letby: no, I am not. Mr. Johnson asks Letby to look at a defence statement for the 3:30 p.m. incident for child G. Letby said she looked round the screen and saw child G's monitor was off, she was alone and behind the screen. Mr. Johnson asks if that was correct. Letby replies, yes. The statement adds Letby wanted the matter of child G being left alone on the procedural trolley behind the screens by a doctor brought to attention, but a nursing colleague did not want to report this. Letby agrees it was an innocent coincidence that she was the only nurse in the room at this time. Mr. Johnson said Letby had told in evidence that Letby was preoccupied with other babies in the room she was caring for, while doctors tried to cannulate child G behind screens for some time. The court is shown a neonatal schedule for child G and other babies for September the 21st. Letby is recorded as having 3 duties for other babies in the 90 minutes prior to child G's collapse. One of the 3 events was for a differently designated nurse's baby in room 2. Letby says that does not mean she was not preoccupied with other babies and may have been dealing with their families or other duties. Letby is asked about the event and her looking behind the screen, that child G was, quote, dusky, blue and not breathing. Letby is asked if that was true. She replies, yes. Letby agrees she picked child G up, put her in a cot and neopuffed her. She says the neopuff equipment would not stretch to the trolley. A nursing colleague froze and went to get a separate nursing colleague. Letby said in evidence she was very concerned by what had happened. Mr Johnson says one thing not mentioned in the defence statement was Letby moving child G from the trolley to the cot. He asks why Letby had not mentioned that. Letby says she cannot say. Mr Johnson says Letby took advantage of a situation that presented itself. Letby replies, no. Mr Johnson says when the cannulation process was taking place, Letby must have been in the room. Letby says she would not have been there all the time. One of the charts is shown for a baby that Letby was looking after, with the chart requiring readings that took about 5 minutes to make. Letby says she was in and out of the nursery all day, on activities that did not require being cot-side. She says she does not recall at any point being told by doctors they had finished with the cannulation process for child G. Letby says it would have been up to the doctors to remove the screens and make sure child G was safely back in her cot following the cannulation. Mr Johnson moves on to the case of child H. Letby says she does recall child H due to the chest drains that were in place. Letby said chest drains had to be couriered from Arrow Park Hospital. It was unacceptable that they didn't have sufficient supplies at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Mr Johnson asks if Letby filled in a DATIX form for that. Letby says she does not recall. Letby is asked about the text message she sent to Yvonne Griffiths on September 26, 2015, which said, quote, "Thank you, that's really nice to hear. As I gather you are aware of some of the not so positive comments that have been made recently regarding my role, which I have found quite upsetting. Our job is a pleasure to do, and just hope I do my best for the babies and their family." The court hears this was with regard to Letby and colleague Shelley Tomlins being allocated shifts in room 1 over other nurses who needed the experience. Letby says she cannot recall which nurses specifically had been making those comments, but they were Band 6 nurses. Letby agrees this message followed events for child H. Mr Johnson refers to the staffing rota for September the 25th and 26th. Letby says it was not the night shift who were making the comments. Mr Johnson asks if it was the day shift, why did they allocate child H to Letby? Letby replies the comments had come in recent days prior to this. Letby, in her defence statement, questioned how familiar the doctors were with chest drains. Letby, when questioned on this, says this would be non-consultants. In her defence statement, Letby said she could not recall the specific details of child H's collapses. Letby is asked to refer to her defence statement, in which she said her memory for both nights when child H collapsed merged into one. Letby added she was also looking after a severely disabled baby. Letby now accepts the disabled baby was born later in the shift. Letby tells the court staffing levels were not a contributory factor in child H's collapses. Letby said she would question whether the chest drains were securely put in for child H, as a potential contributory factor in child H's collapses. So that concludes day 4 of the cross-examination in court of the nurse Lucy Letby. If you wish to stay up to date with the latest news concerning this trial, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below. As always, many thanks for joining me for this video. I look forward to seeing you all again for the next one. Take care. Cheers.